So today we're going to be doing an install of a Phantom splitboard binding ride system. We've got all the tools that we need here on the table. We've got our M6 bindings, we have splitboard specific board cleats, we've got our Loctite, and we have our Phantom install tool with a T30 driver for tightening the screws on our blank deck. So to get started, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we have Loctite on all of our screws. When you get your kit from Phantom splitboard bindings, all of your screws are going to come with Loctite already on the screws. However, if you decide that you need to move your bindings from one board to another, you'll need to reapply with the blue Loctite provided by Phantom. You can get this at any hardware store if you run out of it, but it's very important to apply it every time. As you can see here, all we need is this tiny little bit of blue. We don't need to cover the whole screw. So to get started, I'm going to grab my board plates, line them up on here with my split board. And we're going to tighten these about 3/4 of the way. We don't want to tighten them all the way just yet. Now that we've gotten them on the board, they should be able to move around freely. So now that we've got our board plates set, we're going to grab our binding as a guide to make sure that we have these where we want. And what we're going for is that this junction here should be in line with the center cut of our board. So moving it around right there looks good to me. I'm going to use my fingers to hold it tight while I tighten up the screws. All right, now it's time to set our binding angles. And there's two ways that we can adjust our binding angles with the Phantom splitboard binding system. The first is on the board plates and the second is with the board cleats. To get started, we're going to decide where we need to mount our cleat onto the board plate. Each one of these holes represents a 15-degree change. Starting here would be at 0, moving on to here would be 15 degrees, and here would be 30. Here on our board cleat, each one of these notches represents 5 degrees, and this arrow points to the one that you've selected. So currently we're at 0 degrees. Now here we are at 5, 10, and 15. For me, I like to ride with about 25 degrees of forward angle. If we were to just mount right on these first two screws, we'd be starting at 0 degrees. But since I want 20, I'm going to move on to the next ones here, and we're going to be at 15 degrees. We're just going to get these started. We're not going to tighten them all the way quite yet. Now that we've got our front cleat in, we're going to put our back cleat on the board. So starting here, we've got 0 degrees, and moving over this way, we've got 15 degrees. So I'm going to use these holes here. Now that we've got our binding angles mostly set, we're going to grab our binding, twist it on to do my final angle adjustment. I'm going to push the pins in here to the cleats, and you can see here this gives me a really smooth way to adjust my angles. So starting here, we've got our bindings at 0 degrees on our cleats and 15 degrees on our plates. So we have a total angle of 15 degrees. Now to increase it, I'm going to move the binding over to the left. Now we're on the next notch, which would be 20 degrees. Like I said, I like to ride at about 25 degrees. So I'm going to move the binding till the arrow points at the 25-degree angle. I'm going to hold it in place, and I'm going to tighten down my board cleats. Finally, it's important that we tighten all of our screws with our tool in the T-grip fashion. Make sure we have a nice secure connection. Now we're going to talk about adjusting the locking pins on our bindings. To do this, we're going to need our hex tool and our flathead screwdriver tool that came with our kit. So to get started, we want to make sure that this nut is backed all the way off of the threaded locking pin so that this can move freely. To adjust the locking pin, we're going to take our flathead screwdriver and slowly start tightening it until we're happy with the tolerance. So that's still too loose. Getting closer, I'm just going to do a 1/4 turn here. And this is perfect. So what we've got here is we have a little bit of resistance, but then when we push it in place, it flips right in, and there's no movement in the front of our binding. Once we're happy with the tolerance of our locking pin, we're going to take our hex tool and tighten this nut until it's tight on the binding. Now we're all set. Once you've adjusted the front locking pin, repeat the process on the back until both pins are tight in the V-slots and there's no play in the binding whatsoever. When it's finally time to go snowboarding, it's important that we're using the right binding on the right foot. Phantom has canted bales on their bindings to help relieve pressure on the knees, so it's important to use the right one. The elevated side of the bale should be facing towards the front of the board. So for me, I'm a regular footed rider. My left foot's going to be facing this way. This is my left binding. So I want to make sure that the high side of my canted bale is facing towards the front of my board. Once our setup is complete, Our binding should rotate freely underneath the cleats, and the pins should clip in effortlessly into the board cleats.